The blizzard of '71 was closing in, a storm fierce enough to bury the town under feet of snow. But while everyone scrambled for shelter, one man stood by his creation, a Hay-Bale fortress that no one believed could survive the coming storm. As the winds howled, only one structure remained standing strong against nature's wrath. Before we dive into the story of survival, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss how this unbelievable tale unfolds. The small town of Chesterton had never seen anything quite like it. As the first few hay bales were stacked in a loose, jagged pattern, the townsfolk gathered, eyes wide with disbelief. It was an odd sight, a structure built out of something so common, yet so unconventional, for something as important as a shelter. Most of them had known the old man for years, a solitary figure, always the one who kept to himself, never quite fitting in with the rest. But this time the strange and eccentric idea wasn't just another one of his wild notions. It was a full-fledged construction project. Hay bales? He's building a house out of hay bales? Henry Wilkins, the local blacksmith, let out a boisterous laugh. Good luck with that, old man Garrett. Might as well try building a castle out of straw. Garrett didn't respond. His weathered face held no trace of doubt, only quiet determination. He was used to the mockery. It was something he'd endured for years, ever since he'd come to Chesterton, determined to make a life in the harsh wilderness. Now, in the face of an incoming blizzard, he had decided that his time had come to prove everyone wrong. No one else seemed concerned about the massive storm brewing on the horizon, but Garrett had lived in the wilderness long enough to recognize the signs. And as the town continued to mock him, he merely worked, his hands moving with precision, stacking the hay bales one on top of another, tying them together with thick twine. It wasn't just the hay bales that made the structure seem ridiculous. It was the shape. Garrett was not building a standard cabin. No, this was different. The roof would be curved, a Quonset-style hut, resembling the shape of a barn more than a home. But he had his reasons. A shape like this would resist the winds better, he thought, and the insulation from the hay bales would offer warmth against the bitter cold. He'd thought it through, every detail of it, but the others couldn't see it. All they saw was a man in the middle of a snowstorm, stacking hay bales in an odd, crooked shape. They made jokes, some kinder than others. Well, he certainly won't have to worry about catching a cold in there, one woman whispered, her eyes crinkling in a chuckle. Garrett kept working, and with every bale, he felt a little more certain of his decision. He knew that while the town might laugh now, the blizzard that was coming would tell a different story. The winds would howl, the snow would bury the land, and he would be the only one safe, sheltered within the thick walls he was building. By the time the storm arrived, he would be ready, and the townsfolk would understand just how wrong they were. But for now, all he could do was continue stacking the bales, brick by brick, as the others continued to shake their heads and laugh. He had no intention of explaining himself. The storm would speak for him. As Garrett continued his work, the murmurs of the town grew louder, more insistent. Some had started to think he was losing his mind. It wasn't just the hay bales. It was his entire way of living. Garrett was a man who had always done things his own way, whether it was living off the land or speaking his mind, no matter how uncomfortable it made those around him. And now it seemed his eccentricity had reached new heights. Yet he was determined to prove that he knew something they didn't. The next day Garrett set out again for more hay. His horse trudged through the deep snow, its hooves crunching with each step. He had already gathered most of the hay from nearby farms, but it wasn't enough. He needed more bales to complete the outer walls and finish the roof. On the way to the barn, Garrett passed by several homes. The farmers were busy fortifying their properties, boarding windows, reinforcing doors, and making sure their roofs were secured. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the storm was already descending upon them, but no one paid attention to Garrett. His strange project had been dismissed as little more than an oddity, a quirk that would be forgotten as soon as the storm passed. He reached the barn just as the sky began to darken, clouds swirling ominously overhead. The wind had started to pick up, biting at his skin, carrying with it the unmistakable chill of an approaching storm. His breath came out in heavy clouds, and his fingers felt numb despite the thick gloves he wore. Garrett paused for a moment, scanning the horizon. The sky was an ugly shade of gray, and the wind carried the scent of snow. Heavy snow. He could feel it in his bones. This was no ordinary storm. Inside the barn, Garrett began gathering hay bales, stacking them carefully onto his sled. He worked quickly, but his mind kept wandering back to the task at hand. The walls of his hay bale shelter were almost done. All that was left was the roof, a Quonset-style roof, curved like a half-moon. He had spent hours working out the best way to arrange the bales to withstand the weight of the snow, to keep the structure from collapsing. But it was more than just the structure. It was the isolation, the feeling of being on his own in a world that didn't understand. There was a certain peace in that solitude. The storm would come, and Garrett would be ready. He had no doubt about that. As he finished loading the last of the hay onto his sled, Garrett heard the distant sound of a horse's hooves. Turning, he saw Henry Wilkins, the blacksmith, riding toward him. Henry's face was grim, and his usually boisterous demeanor was subdued. "Garrett," Henry called, pulling up beside him, "that shelter of yours, it's going to get tested, isn't it? A storm like this, it's no joke." Garrett nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I'm ready. My shelter's ready. More than ready." Henry hesitated. "Well, if you're right, I suppose we'll all be knocking on your door." Garrett smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of certainty. The storm was coming, and when it hit, the people who had laughed at him would realize that Garrett had been preparing for this moment all along. By the time Garrett had finished gathering the remaining hay bales, the storm had already begun to show its true power. The winds picked up, howling through the trees, sending the fresh snow swirling in every direction. It was a sight that both fascinated and terrified Garrett. He had seen blizzards before, but this one felt different. The air had a bite to it, sharper than usual, and the clouds in the sky were darker, heavier. He knew that whatever was coming was going to be a beast of a storm. Still, he pressed on. The hay bale structure was nearly finished. The outer walls were solid and secure, with the bales packed tightly together. But now, as the wind whistled around him, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling of doubt that had started to creep into his mind. He had worked tirelessly, confident that this would work, but with the storm arriving sooner than expected, there was no more time for second-guessing. He stood outside the structure for a moment, surveying the work he had done. The curved roof was nearly complete, with the hay bales stacked higher in the center and tapering toward the sides. It looked odd, but then again, it had always looked odd. The town had laughed at him, just as he had known they would, but he had stood his ground. His creation, though unconventional, was going to be his salvation, or so he thought. Garrett's breath came out in sharp puffs, the air growing colder by the minute. The wind howled in a furious gust, sending a flurry of snowflakes swirling in every direction. He had just placed the last bale on the roof when a thought struck him. What if this didn't work? What if the snow piled up too high, too fast? What if the bales gave way under the weight? His hands trembled slightly as he placed another bale in position, but he shook the thought from his mind. The doubts weren't going to help him now. He had committed to this. The town's ridicule didn't matter anymore. The structure would stand. It had to. He stepped back and looked at it again. From the outside, the hay bale structure looked vulnerable, as though it might collapse at any moment. The rest of the town's homes, sturdy and well-built, stood confidently against the wind. But his structure, it was different. It was a gamble, a desperate bid to survive against a force of nature that could crush everything in its path. Garrett shook his head. He couldn't afford to entertain these doubts. The storm would be here soon, and he had no intention of letting it defeat him. He walked around the structure, checking every corner and making sure the bales were as secure as they could be. As he worked, a cold realization settled in. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was staking his life on it. And then, as though to challenge his resolve, the wind picked up again, fiercer this time. The hay bales creaked and shifted slightly, making Garrett pause. He couldn't help but wonder if the storm would be enough to tear it all apart. But there was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and entered the shelter. The inside was still empty, save for a few tools and the faint smell of hay. He knew the storm was coming, but for a moment, the quiet inside the structure made it feel like he could escape the storm. The warmth from his body and the promise of shelter would be enough. For now. That night, the storm hit with a ferocity Garrett had never experienced before. The wind screamed through the trees like a living thing, rattling the branches and shaking the very ground beneath him. The snow came down in thick, swirling sheets, nearly blinding anyone foolish enough to be out in it. Inside his hay bale structure, Garrett huddled by the fire, his mind racing. The storm had arrived much earlier than he had anticipated, and it was as violent as he feared. The walls of the structure trembled under the pressure of the wind, and the snow outside piled up rapidly, making the world outside look like an unrecognizable blur. Garrett could hear the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the bales, but it wasn't the terrifying sound of destruction, at least not yet. No, it was just the storm testing its strength, probing for weaknesses. Garrett couldn't rest. He kept his hand near the rifle propped against the wall, ready for anything that might come through the door. But the door remained sturdy, as did the rest of the structure. For now, he felt safe. Still, every gust of wind made him second-guess his choice of shelter. Could this truly withstand what was coming? Outside, the storm raged, the snow piling higher with each passing hour. It wasn't just the wind and snow that Garrett feared. It was the weight of the snow itself. If the hay bales couldn't hold, everything would collapse and he would be trapped, unable to get out. The idea made his stomach churn, but there was nothing he could do now except wait and pray. The hours dragged on, and the storm continued to pound relentlessly against the hay bale structure. At one point, Garrett thought he heard a crack, a sharp splintering noise coming from the roof. His heart raced as he grabbed his lantern and made his way toward the sound. But when he opened the door and stepped outside, the blinding snow made it impossible to see anything. The howling wind was deafening, and he couldn't make out a thing. He stepped back inside, his heart hammering in his chest. The storm wasn't letting up, and his doubts, the ones he had pushed away earlier, were creeping back into his mind. Was this really going to work? Would he be able to survive this onslaught? Then, just as quickly as it had come, the storm shifted, the wind momentarily dying down. Garrett rushed to the window, wiping away the frost that had gathered on the glass. Through the heavy snow, he could see that the town was all but covered in snow. The homes that had seemed so sturdy earlier now looked fragile, like they might be swallowed by the storm at any moment. But his shelter? It was standing firm. The hay bale structure, though battered, had held its ground against the storm. Garrett exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't know if it would survive the entire storm, but for now, it had done what he needed it to. And as the winds began to howl again, Garrett allowed himself a small, quiet smile. He wasn't defeated yet. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the storm had only intensified. What had started as a few light flurries the evening before had now transformed into an all-out blizzard. The winds howled relentlessly, carrying sheets of snow that stung like needles against exposed skin. Garrett stood at the doorway of his shelter, staring into the white chaos that consumed everything in sight. The world beyond the hay bale structure had vanished, swallowed up by the swirling mass of snow. He hadn't slept much. The hours passed in a haze of vigilance, punctuated by the sounds of the storm battering the walls. The wind rattled the hay bales, but they held firm. He wasn't sure if the storm was testing the shelter's limits or if it was simply going to do what it wanted, regardless of what stood in its path. Either way, it had made its intentions clear. This wasn't going to be an easy night, and the worst was still to come. The town was quiet, as it usually was when a storm like this struck, but Garrett knew that quiet wouldn't last for long. He was accustomed to the rhythms of these storms, but most of Chesterton wasn't. The other settlers were used to small snowstorms and brief cold snaps, but nothing on the scale of what was unfolding now. If Garrett was right, this blizzard was going to test every man, woman, and child in the town. He stood for a long while, simply watching the storm. His breath fogged up the window, and the cold crept in even through the thick walls of the shelter. Despite his deep knowledge of the land and the winter, there was something unsettling about the raw power of nature when it was unleashed like this. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was tearing everything apart in its path. A part of him felt a strange sense of calm, though. His shelter was holding. It was standing strong against the elements, where other homes might fail. Still, he wasn't naive enough to think that this was over. The storm was still in its early stages. As he stood there waiting for what was next, he heard the distant sound of horses' hooves. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, Garrett knew who it was. Henry Wilkins, the blacksmith, rode up to the Hay-Bale shelter on horseback. Garrett could barely make him out through the storm's fury, but he saw the silhouette of the horse and its rider, silhouetted against the white blur of the blizzard. "Garrett!" Henry's voice was barely audible over the wind. "We're all battening down. The storm's hitting harder than we thought. Thought you might need some help." Garrett stepped out to meet him, nodding in recognition. "I'm good. The shelter's holding for now, but we need to prepare for the worst." Henry looked at the structure, his brow furrowing. "You're serious about this? I thought you were crazy, but this thing, it might just hold up." Garrett gave a small, tight smile. "We'll see. But it's not just about the shelter. It's about what comes next. If the storm hits the town as bad as I think it will, we'll all need to help each other." The wind howled again, drowning out any further conversation. Garrett gestured for Henry to follow him inside. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. And right now, that was all that mattered. As the door shut behind them, Garrett knew it was just the beginning. The storm was coming for everyone, and he had no idea just how far it would push them. The storm raged through the night, its fury unmatched. Inside the Hay-Bale shelter, Garrett and Henry huddled close to the fire, the warmth of the crackling flames a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. Despite the small comfort of the fire, the wind howled through the cracks in the bales, making the shelter groan and shudder with each gust. It was a restless night, one filled with uncertainty, but also a strange sense of purpose. The town, like the shelter, had been slowly consumed by the storm. Garrett could only imagine the scenes outside, snow piling up, buildings crumbling under the weight, and the desperate race to survive. He had heard the wind carry the sounds of collapsed roofs and broken shutters as the storm tore through Chesterton, leaving nothing untouched by its wrath. Inside the shelter, though, things were different. It wasn't perfect. The wind whistled through the cracks in the bales, and snow had managed to seep in around the edges, but the shelter was still standing. More importantly, Garrett and Henry were warm, and that, in a storm like this, was more than they could have hoped for. Henry was quiet for a long while, his eyes fixed on the fire. Garrett could see the conflict in his friend's face, part doubt, part relief. A few hours ago, Henry had been skeptical of Garrett's Hay-Bale shelter, but now he was starting to realize that it might just be the only thing between them. And the storm's unrelenting rage. "Garrett," Henry finally spoke, his voice low and unsure, "I never thought I'd be here. Thought your idea was crazy, but this thing, it's holding up better than anything else in town." Garrett didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, his gaze fixed on the flickering light. The storm outside seemed to be picking up again, and the howling wind filled the silence between them. Garrett knew Henry wasn't just talking about the shelter. He was talking about Garrett himself, the man who had dared to think outside the box, the man who had trusted in something no one else believed in. "You're not the only one who thought it was crazy," Garrett said after a long pause, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet satisfaction. "But sometimes crazy is the only way to survive." Henry gave a low chuckle. "Guess so. Guess we'll see how long this lasts." As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled louder and the snow piled higher, but inside the Hay-Bale shelter, Garrett and Henry remained safe. It was a strange, unsettling peace, knowing that they were surrounded by chaos, yet still standing strong. But even in this small victory, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The blizzard of '71 was only beginning, and Garrett knew that in the days to come, this shelter, this strange, unconventional shelter, would face a test far greater than anything it had encountered so far. But for now, they were alive. And that, Garrett thought, was something worth holding on to. The night stretched on, and the storm's fury showed no sign of abating. Inside the Hay-Bale shelter, the wind whipped relentlessly, causing the walls to groan as if they might collapse under the pressure. Garrett kept his eyes on the fire, its warmth a fleeting comfort in the face of the raging chaos outside. He could hear the sound of branches cracking and the distant howls of animals searching for shelter. He knew the storm was growing stronger, that this wasn't just another winter blizzard. This was something fierce, something that would test them all. Garrett sat up, listening intently. His mind, always alert to the elements, told him that the worst was yet to come. He had built the shelter with a purpose, but no amount of preparation could fully protect them from the power of nature. The thought gnawed at him as he stood and approached the window. The snow outside was thick, almost suffocating. The world had become a blur of white, and there was no telling how far the storm would reach. Henry stirred behind him, his voice low. "You think it's going to get worse?" Garrett nodded, his face grim. "The winds are shifting. This storm's not going to let up easily. We've only seen the beginning." Henry leaned against the wall, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. "You really think we're going to make it through this?" Garrett didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of the question, the unspoken fear hanging in the air. Everyone had their doubts now. The storm had come in harder than anyone expected, and though his shelter had held strong so far, there was no telling how much more it could take. "Storms like this don't just test you physically," Garrett said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of experience. "They test your resolve. You've got to outlast it, Henry. Not just survive it. You've got to outlast it. That's the difference." Henry looked at him, a deep understanding in his eyes. Garrett had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke it carried the weight of experience. He wasn't afraid of the storm. He was simply prepared for it, both physically and mentally. That was something the rest of the town didn't understand. They were scrambling, trying to patch up their homes, but Garrett had known for a long time that something like this was coming. The wind howled again, stronger this time, shaking the walls of the shelter. Snow piled higher against the door, making it harder for the wind to find its way inside. For a moment, the shelter felt like an island in the midst of a vast white ocean, and Garrett knew that the storm was not just testing the Hay-Bale structure, it was testing everything he had prepared for. "We'll make it," Garrett said, turning away from the window. "But we need to stay sharp. This isn't over." Henry nodded, and for the first time in hours, the two of them sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The fire crackled, the only sound that could compete with the wind. As the storm continued to batter the world around them, Garrett knew there was no going back. The storm would do what it would, but he had built something that had a chance of withstanding it, and for now, that was enough. As the hours passed, the storm showed no mercy. The wind continued to scream, the snow piling higher and higher against the door and windows. Inside the hay-bale shelter, Garrett and Henry remained, the fire crackling softly in the corner. Despite the comfort of the warmth, there was a tension in the air, a quiet unease that neither man could shake. The storm outside was relentless, testing the limits of everything in its path. Garrett stood and walked over to the door. He could hear the wind howling like a wild animal, desperate to tear through anything it could find. He pressed his hand against the door, feeling the cold seep through the cracks where the snow had managed to get in. But still, the walls of the shelter held strong. The hay bales, tightly packed and reinforced, had withstood the storm's assault better than any traditional structure Garrett had ever seen. Henry joined him by the door, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "I can't believe it," he muttered, looking out at the snow, which seemed to be falling even faster now. "It's actually holding. I thought for sure it had come down by now." Garrett nodded, his eyes scanning the shelter's interior. There was still some snow piled against the edges, but the roof and walls were intact. The hay bales, though battered, had held their form. He had been right to trust his instincts. The Quonset-style structure had provided the strength and stability they needed. "Not yet," Garrett said, his voice calm but his mind alert. "We're not out of it yet. There's still a lot more to come." Outside, the storm continued its assault, but for now, they had weathered the worst of it. The walls of the shelter groaned with each gust of wind, but they didn't buckle. Garrett knew that they were living on borrowed time. The storm could still change, could still bring even greater force, but for now, the structure had proven itself. Henry exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. "I've got to hand it to you, Garrett. You were right. This place is standing strong." Garrett gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's not just me, it's the design. The hay bales lock together in a way that no wood or stone could. It's the way the weight's distributed, the way the roof curves. It's built to withstand the pressure, and that's what counts." Henry nodded thoughtfully, his gaze turning back to the swirling snow outside. The rest of the town had likely succumbed to the storm's fury by now. The shelters they had built, sturdy as they were, would have been no match for the full force of the blizzard. But here, inside Garrett's creation, they were safe. They had shelter when others had none. For the first time in hours, the two men allowed themselves a moment of peace. The wind still howled, but it wasn't as frightening as it had been before. They were not alone, and they were not helpless. They had built something that had held up against the storm, and that was a victory in itself. Garrett leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, and looked at Henry. "We'll be all right. This place will see us through." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the shelter there was warmth, safety, and the knowledge that they had done what no one else could. They had built something strong enough to stand against nature's fury. The wind howled through the cracks in the hay bale structure, its icy fingers creeping in around the edges, but the shelter remained steadfast. Garrett stood by the fire, his eyes scanning the room as the flames flickered and cast long shadows across the walls. The storm had been raging for nearly 2 full days now, and the landscape outside was barely recognizable. What had once been familiar homes and streets were now hidden beneath a thick blanket of snow, with only the occasional wisp of smoke rising from chimneys marking where life still existed. Inside it was a strange sort of peace. Garrett had never known the storm to last this long. It was different from any blizzard he had experienced before, relentless, almost predatory in its persistence. The hay-bale shelter was holding up far better than he had dared hope. The structure had become their lifeline, their sanctuary against the blizzard's fury. And yet, the silence that hung in the air, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind, made it clear that the worst might still be ahead. Henry stirred from his place by the hearth, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You really think this storm's going to last much longer?" Garrett didn't answer immediately. He was watching the snow outside, his eyes narrowing against the heavy white curtain that obscured everything beyond the shelter's walls. He had always been a man of few words, but when it came to the wilderness, his silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to explain what he already knew. The storm was not going to let up. It had more to show, more to prove. "Hard to say," Garrett replied, his voice low and steady. "But storms like this don't give up easily. We've just got to keep our heads. The shelter's doing its job, and that's all we can ask for right now." Henry glanced at him, his eyes full of questions, but he didn't press. The two of them had always understood each other without needing many words. Garrett had built the shelter with his bare hands, each bale placed carefully, each log secured tightly. He had known it was the only chance they had. The town's traditional homes were no match for this kind of storm. But his creation? His creation had a chance to survive. Outside, the wind picked up again, sending the snow into a frenzy. Garrett felt the bite of the cold even inside the shelter. It was as if the storm was testing them, probing for weaknesses. But so far the shelter had held. Every crack, every crevice had been accounted for. The hay bales were tightly packed, the roof arched with just the right curve to shed the weight of the snow. Henry stood up and walked over to the window. The blizzard had obscured their view, but he could still see the snow drifting against the walls, rising in layers. "If this keeps up, how long do you think we can stay here?" Garrett didn't hesitate. "As long as it takes. The storm will pass, it always does. But until it does, we'll make it through." Henry nodded, his face set with determination. The reality of the situation was sinking in. The storm wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a force of nature, something that had the power to destroy everything they knew. But inside the hay-bale structure, they were safe. And that was a victory no one else in Chesterton could claim. The two men sat back down by the fire, their shadows stretching long on the walls. Outside, the blizzard roared on, but inside, Garrett knew they had one thing that mattered: survival. As the third day of the storm began, the tension inside the hay-bale shelter was just as palpable. Garrett stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the endless white expanse outside. The wind had subsided slightly, but the snow was still falling hard, driven by gusts that whipped through the trees and flattened the landscape. It was the kind of storm that didn't just pass. It changed everything. The temperature had plummeted. Even with the fire burning brightly, the cold crept into every corner of the shelter. Garrett could feel it in his bones, the weight of the storm pressing down on him. It was as if the world outside had gone silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that shook the walls. The hay-bale structure, so carefully built, was being tested with every breath of the storm. Garrett wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. Inside, Henry was sitting by the fire, sharpening his axe with methodical strokes. The rhythmic sound of the metal against the stone was the only noise that broke the silence. Henry had been quiet since the storm began, lost in his own thoughts, but Garrett could tell he was beginning to feel the strain of the endless days and nights in the shelter. The storm was relentless, and as each hour passed, it seemed as if the world outside was shrinking. "We should check the other homes," Henry said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Make sure everyone's still holding up. This thing's not going to end soon. We need to see if anyone else is still in good shape." Garrett shook his head slowly. "It's too dangerous out there. We'll be of no use to anyone if we don't stay here." Henry stood, the axe in his hand now forgotten. "But they need help. We can't just hide out here, hoping the storm passes." Garrett's voice was calm but firm. "The shelter is the only thing that's keeping us alive right now. If we leave, we risk losing it. We're better off staying put and conserving what we have." Henry hesitated, his face drawn with frustration. He wanted to help. He wanted to believe there was more they could do. But Garrett was right. The storm had swallowed the town, and venturing out into it was a fool's errand. Their only chance was to stay safe, wait for the storm to pass, and then help rebuild. The wind howled again, and the shelter groaned under its force. Garrett's thoughts turned inward. He had built this place with one purpose in mind: survival. And now, in the heart of the storm, it was working. But for how long? Suddenly, the door to the shelter rattled. A loud banging echoed against the walls, followed by a voice calling out, muffled by the wind. Garrett's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the door, his breath catching in his throat. Could it be another survivor? Or was the storm finally breaking through? He opened the door a crack, his eyes squinting against the blinding snow. In the doorway stood a figure, their silhouette barely visible against the storm. A voice shouted from the dark, but Garrett couldn't make out the words. Without a second thought, Garrett stepped forward into the storm, knowing that the real test was just beginning. The storm's relentless howl echoed through the barren landscape, but within the walls of the Hay-Bale shelter there was a strange sense of calm. The worst of it had passed. The wind had died down to a fierce but manageable gust, and the snow continued to fall, though less densely than before. The world outside, once buried under layers of blinding snow, now lay under a thick veil of white, still and quiet, save for the occasional whisper of the wind. Garrett stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the horizon. The once familiar landscape of Chesterton was now a featureless expanse of snow. The homes of the townsfolk, once sturdy and proud, were barely visible through the snowdrifts. What had once been a thriving community now seemed fragile, its structures buried under the weight of the storm. The Hay-Bale shelter had held strong, a beacon of survival amidst the chaos. Garrett had built it with every storm in mind, but even he couldn't have predicted how fierce this one would be. Yet, as he stood in the doorway, surveying the damage, a quiet sense of pride washed over him. His creation had withstood the fury of nature, proving that even the most unconventional solutions could endure. Henry emerged from the firelight behind him, his eyes tired but full of quiet admiration. "It's over, isn't it?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the cold. Garrett nodded, his gaze fixed on the world beyond the shelter. "For now. The storm's past, but the damage is done. It's time we see what we've got left." Henry stepped forward, his boots crunching through the snow, as he joined Garrett by the door. Together, they took in the devastation. The storm had left its mark. Some homes had collapsed entirely, while others stood, weakened and broken, their roofs caving in under the weight of the snow. The streets of Chesterton, once full of life, now seemed hollow and still, a ghost town in the wake of the storm's fury. Garrett turned to Henry, his voice steady. "We need to make sure everyone's all right, see who made it through and who needs help." Henry hesitated, looking out at the desolate scene before them. "I'm not sure the others are going to be much help, not after this." Garrett gave him a sharp glance. "That's why we need to be ready. There's no one left but us to rebuild this place. We'll help where we can, but we're going to have to start over, and that means using everything we have." The two men stood for a moment longer, the weight of the storm still hanging in the air. The worst was over, but the aftermath had only just begun. The town had been tested, and it had faltered, but the shelter, Garrett's shelter, had held firm. In the chaos of the storm, it had become the symbol of survival. It was the one thing that had stood strong in the face of nature's fury. With a final glance at the destruction around them, Garrett stepped back inside the shelter, his thoughts turning to the work ahead. The storm had tested them all, but now it was time to rebuild, and for Garrett, that meant more than just repairing what was broken. It meant starting anew, with the knowledge that survival came not from waiting out the storm, but from facing it head-on. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was far from over. Outside, the town of Chesterton lay in ruins, its buildings half buried under snowdrifts. The once bustling streets were now eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of wind stirring the snow. The harsh reality of the destruction was clear. Many of the town's homes were lost, their foundations cracked, roofs caved in. For most of the townsfolk, the storm had been a force too powerful to resist. But Garrett, standing inside the warmth of the Hay-Bale shelter, felt a sense of determination rising within him. The storm had come and gone, but the real test was now. The damage was done, the losses had been counted, and the road to recovery would be long. Yet inside the shelter there was still hope. Henry sat on a nearby log, staring into the fire. His face was tired, and the weight of the storm's aftermath seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders. He had lost his home, along with many of the other townsfolk. Like most people in Chesterton, he had never imagined that the storm could bring such destruction. But now, with the storm finally behind them, Henry was coming to terms with the reality that the town would have to rebuild, starting from scratch. Garrett, however, wasn't fazed. He knew that survival wasn't about waiting for things to go back to normal. It was about adapting, about finding a way forward even when everything around you had been torn apart. He had seen the town's homes collapse under the weight of the storm, but his Hay-Bale shelter had withstood. It had stood firm, and it had given them a chance. "We'll rebuild," Garrett said, his voice steady and resolute. "The town may be gone, but we've still got each other. We've got this shelter, and we've got the skills to make it through." Henry didn't reply right away. He looked at Garrett, his expression softening. "I didn't think it was possible. I thought you were crazy. But now I see." Garrett gave him a small, knowing smile. Sometimes it's the crazy ideas that work. The two men sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the fire keeping them grounded amid the storm's lingering cold. Garrett's thoughts turned inward. He had spent years learning how to survive in the wilderness, to build shelters, to withstand storms. But this storm, this blizzard of '71, had tested him in ways he had never imagined. It had pushed him to the edge, made him question everything he had known about survival. And yet, as he sat in the quiet of the shelter, he realized that the storm had shown him something important. It wasn't about the structure itself. It wasn't just about hay bales or construction techniques. It was about the people who relied on those structures, the community that needed something to believe in. As the fire crackled and the storm outside began to lose its bite, Garrett knew that survival wasn't just about building something strong. It was about building something that could endure, something that could give people hope in the darkest of times. And as long as he had his shelter, as long as they had each other, Garrett knew that Chesterton would rise again. The morning after the storm was eerily quiet. The winds had died down, and the snow continued to fall lightly, covering the remains of the once thriving town of Chesterton with a thick, silent blanket. As Garrett stepped outside the shelter, he was struck by the sheer devastation around him. Where homes once stood proudly, now only broken remnants remained, roofs caved in, walls leaning at odd angles, and the deep, persistent crunch of snow underfoot where streets had once been. Chesterton was buried, and there was no telling how many lives had been lost. But what struck Garrett most of all was the stillness. The storm had ravaged the town in a way he had never seen before. The wind had torn through everything, leaving behind only silence. But as he gazed across the horizon, Garrett realized something that made his heart heavy. Not all the people in the town had made it. He had seen homes collapse, and he feared that many hadn't made it to shelter in time. "Garrett, you out here?" Henry's voice called from behind him, startling him out of his thoughts. Henry had emerged from the shelter with his face drawn, his coat pulled tightly around him to ward off the cold. "Yeah," Garrett replied, his voice quiet, almost swallowed by the silence. "Just trying to make sense of it." Henry nodded grimly and came to stand beside him. Together they surveyed the wreckage. Snow had piled up against the remains of the buildings, the weight of it pressing the already fragile structures further into the earth. "I never thought it'd get this bad," Henry said, his voice shaky, a hint of disbelief still evident in his words. "We've seen storms before, but this is something else." Garrett's gaze never left the horizon where the town's edges were obscured by heavy drifts of snow. "It's a force of nature," he said quietly. "No amount of preparation is enough to stop it. But we can survive it. Henry turned to him. You mean you think we can rebuild? After all of this? Garrett took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. He'd seen people lose everything, seen their homes and livelihoods torn apart by the storm. But he had also seen something else, something that no one else had. Look at the shelter, Garrett said, his voice steady. It's still standing. We've got that. The town may be gone, but we still have a chance. We've got people here, and we've got the skills to rebuild. It's not going to be easy, but it's possible. And that's what matters. Henry stood in silence for a moment, his eyes scanning the damage. Finally he nodded. I guess it's worth a try. With renewed purpose, the two men made their way through the snow-covered town, carefully picking their way over debris and collapsed structures. Every now and then they would stop to check on a fallen roof or a broken wall, seeing if anyone was trapped or needed help. The town was devastated, but the survivors were still here, still alive. And as long as that was the case, there was hope. Garrett's thoughts raced as they worked their way through the wreckage. They would need to rebuild not just the town's physical structures, but its spirit. The people would need something to hold on to, something to believe in, and he, Garrett, would be the one to lead them through it. He had built the shelter that had kept them safe during the storm, and now he would build the foundation for a new Chesterton. We've got work to do, Garrett said finally, a firm resolve in his voice, but we'll make it through this. We'll rebuild. Days passed, and as Chesterton began to emerge from beneath the weight of the storm, the survivors came together in a shared sense of purpose. Garrett and Henry spent their days helping people salvage what they could from the wreckage of their homes. Though most of the town's structures had been destroyed, there were still tools, materials, and supplies left behind that could be used for the work ahead. The Hay-Bale shelter had become a gathering point for the survivors. It was sturdy, warm, and the only place untouched by the storm. Every evening, as the snow continued to fall, more and more people came to the shelter, seeking refuge and comfort from the brutal cold. It was becoming clear that the structure Garrett had built was more than just a shelter. It had become the heart of their recovery. But even as Garrett worked alongside the people of Chesterton, he couldn't ignore the doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. The town was a shell of what it had been. Rebuilding it would take time, resources, and effort that he wasn't sure they had, but he had no choice. He couldn't let this disaster break them, not when he had the knowledge and the will to see them through. One evening, as Garrett was checking the shelter's supplies, he was surprised to see Henry approaching, a determined look on his face. "Garrett, we need to talk," he said, his voice low but urgent. Garrett looked up, setting down the pile of firewood he had been stacking. "What's on your mind?" Henry stepped closer, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. "I've been thinking about all of this, about what you've done. I didn't believe in you at first. I thought you were crazy with that Hay-Bale shelter. But now I see it. I see what you've built. And I think you were right all along." Garrett's eyebrows furrowed, surprised by Henry's words. "Right about what?" Henry took a deep breath. "Right about survival. Right about thinking outside the box. I was wrong to doubt you. You built something that saved us. And now it's time we all start doing the same. I'm in. Whatever it takes to rebuild this town, I'm with you." For the first time since the storm, Garrett felt a surge of gratitude. Henry had always been a skeptic, quick to dismiss unconventional ideas. But now he was standing beside Garrett, ready to help rebuild not just Chesterton's homes, but the spirit of the community. "We'll do it together," Garrett said, his voice steady. "We're in this for the long haul." And as Henry nodded, a sense of hope bloomed in Garrett's chest. The road ahead was still uncertain, the damage still vast, but for the first time in days, he believed they could rebuild together. As the days turned to weeks, word of Garrett's Hay-Bale shelter began to spread throughout the town. The survivors, weary and broken, came to see for themselves the strength of the structure that had kept them safe during the worst of the storm. At first, there were hesitant glances, then whispered conversations. and eventually requests for Garrett to teach them how he had built it. One by one, the townsfolk began gathering around Garrett, eager to learn the techniques that had saved them. Some had lost their homes entirely, while others had suffered serious damage. They wanted to rebuild, but they knew that it couldn't be done the way it had been before. The storm had proven the old ways were no longer enough. With patience, Garrett showed them how to stack the bales, how to reinforce the corners, and how to ensure the structure could withstand whatever nature threw their way. As the town began to rebuild, Garrett felt a quiet sense of pride. His creation was no longer just a shelter. It was the foundation of a new beginning. The town, though scarred, had found hope in the most unlikely place. As Chesterton slowly began to take shape once more, the townspeople found themselves stronger and more united than ever before. Garrett had become a quiet hero in the eyes of many. Yet he never sought praise. His satisfaction came from seeing his neighbors come together, rebuilding their homes with the techniques he had shared. Life started to return to the town, though in a new form. The Hay-Bale structures stood sturdy against the coming winter, and the warmth of the community was far stronger than the cold that had once threatened to tear them apart. One evening, as Garrett stood looking out at the horizon, watching the first light of sunset break through the clouds, he felt the weight of the journey they had endured. The storm had taken so much from them, but in its wake, it had brought them something far more valuable: unity, resilience, and hope for the future. And for Garrett, that quiet satisfaction, the knowledge that they had survived, was all the reward he needed. The months following the storm were a time of intense labor and quiet reflection. The Hay-Bale shelters had proven their worth, standing resilient against the worst winter the town had ever seen. Chesterton, though scarred by the storm, was rebuilding stronger than ever. Where once there had been isolated homes, now entire neighborhoods were slowly taking shape, each building more fortified and practical than the last. Garrett continued to guide the efforts, his quiet leadership becoming a cornerstone for the town's recovery. He wasn't one for speeches or grand gestures, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. He worked alongside the townsfolk, cutting wood, hauling bales, and reinforcing structures. Slowly but surely, the town was regaining its strength. But even as the town worked, Garrett couldn't shake the nagging feeling that another challenge was looming. The cold, biting winds of winter had returned, harsher than before. The mountains surrounding Chesterton were cloaked in a heavy blanket of snow, and Garrett knew that winter was never truly over until spring had arrived. This winter was different, though. As he worked in the shelter he had built with his own hands, Garrett reflected on how far the town had come. The Hay-Bale structures had been a symbol of survival, but they were also a symbol of the community's resilience. People who had once laughed at Garrett's idea now sought his advice, proud of the structures they had built. Chesterton was not the town it had been before. It had been forged in the crucible of that terrible storm, and now it was stronger, united by shared purpose. Still, the harsh winds that whipped through the valley served as a constant reminder that nature was never to be underestimated. The community was rebuilding, but the real test, Garrett knew, was still ahead. Would the Hay-Bale structures hold through another winter, or would the town have to face yet another challenge? For now, there was a fragile peace. The wind howled outside, but inside the shelters there was warmth. As Garrett stood outside, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, he felt a quiet sense of contentment. The work was far from over, but they had made it through the worst of it, and for that he was grateful. By the time spring arrived, Chesterton had changed. The snow began to melt, revealing the town that had emerged from the storm's grip. The Hay-Bale shelters, once an oddity and a joke, now stood as lasting monuments to survival and ingenuity. The people of Chesterton had rebuilt their homes, not just with physical materials, but with the lessons learned from the storm. Garrett had remained a quiet presence in the town, continuing to guide, teach, and support. His shelter had not only withstood the blizzard of '71, but it had also inspired an entire town to think differently. The idea that something so simple and unconventional could save lives had struck a chord with the people of Chesterton. They weren't just building homes anymore, they were building a community, one that could endure whatever came its way. As the months passed, word spread beyond the town of Garrett's Hay-Bale shelters. Travelers passing through the area stopped to admire the structures, curious about the method that had proven so successful. Garrett never sought fame for his creation. He was content to stay in the background watching the town thrive. But one day, as Garrett was walking through the streets of Chesterton, he was stopped by Henry. "You know, Garrett," Henry began, his voice filled with quiet admiration, "you've built something here. More than just a shelter, you've built a legacy." Garrett stopped in his tracks, his gaze following the curve of a hay-bale shelter that stood proudly against the spring sun. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of us. We did this together." Henry nodded, his eyes soft with appreciation. "Maybe, but it all started with you. And because of that, Chesterton will be here for a long time to come." Garrett didn't answer immediately. He had never been one for accolades or attention. His satisfaction came from seeing the people around him succeed, from watching them rebuild their homes and their lives. But as he stood there looking out at the town he had helped save, Garrett felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. His shelter, born out of necessity and ingenuity, had become the heart of Chesterton's survival. The legacy of the hay-bale shelter wasn't just in the buildings that stood tall against the winter storms. It was in the community that had risen from the rubble, stronger than ever before. And in that moment, Garrett knew that they had not only survived, they had thrived.